Okay, so where we're going to approach this is, today we're going to start with an overview of like the lay of the land, the overarching narrative of the Rambam's Hilchos Teshuva, and we'll learn Perek Aleph, learn the first chapter, and point out various different comments from the Rabbi or comparing to the Alter Rebbe's Teshuva and seeing where they line up, where there are differences and things of that nature. There is a certain way of learning Iyun, learning in depth, and this seems to be the dominant discussion in the commentaries on the side, the Kesef Mishnah and Lechem Mishnah, about where the Rambam's source for whatever he said is, and whether there's a dispute in the Gemara about it and why he picks one view over the other, and it seems to contradict another view and things of that nature. And that's one way of learning in depth, but that's not the way we're going to do it here. Similar to the way of learning Gemara, it's not my style. Just more, what does it say? Assuming his conclusion absolute, now understanding what does it mean to say here, why is it choosing this word, why that word, and especially as you learn it the way the Rebbe does, and you learn it in comparison to the Alter Rebbe's Geras HaTeshuva, each word becomes very precise and contains lots of meaning. So to start with, just as a kind of introduction, B'chlal, you may be aware that the Rambam is unique as a book of halacha in many, many regards. Right? It's the first one to do all of Torah, including parts that are not observed today, like the laws of Beis Mikdash, the laws of Mashiach, and so on. Another area in which I think the Rambam is unique and was a pioneer is in this idea of codifying Jewish philosophy. So the Rambam wrote a book of philosophy, and to some degree also the Rambam's introduction to his commentary on the Mishnah, some of the introduction to Perek Chelek, the last Perek in Sanhedrin, which talks about Mashiach, as well as his introduction to Perek Yavis that are also philosophical in nature, but those are not halachic, they're philosophical to begin with. But the Rambam was the first one to codify Jewish philosophy. Even before the book of halacha, the idea of 13 principles, to enumerate them as principle A, principle B, C, and so on, the Rambam did that in his commentary on the Mishnah. But it's this idea, this notion of codify, it's hard to say it in any other language, but codifying philosophy. In other words, we usually think of philosophy as somewhat like fluid, like you flow from one thing into another, and you think of legality as more rigid. This stands here and this stands there, and so on. And you kind of separate the two, and that's what most of Jewish literature looks like. But in Rambam, he legally defined Jewish philosophy, and you see this in a number of areas. But for example, the most obvious of them is when he starts off his whole book of halacha. The first mitzvah is to believe in God. So before he even says the word God, he defines in 3 or 4 halachas what God is, like a legal definition as to what is God. And then he says, there's a being, a primary being, from which all of the beings get their truth, and so on and so forth. And then in the 4th halacha, he says, and by the way, all of that is God, and the commandment is to believe in this being, right? But it's almost like a legal codified definition to Jewish philosophy. And the same thing comes true in Hilchos Teshuva. The laws of Teshuva is a mitzvah of Teshuva. We learned this already in the Rebbe's introduction, exactly how we define the mitzvah in the halachic sense. But in either way, clear from the Rambam that Teshuva is a mitzvah. And like every other mitzvah, it has to have the actionable items as to you have to do X, Y, and Z to fulfill the mitzvah. But it's the kind of mitzvah that contains within it a lot of philosophy on 2 grounds. Number one, there is what's the code of, the moral code of conduct that inspires Teshuva? What kind of person am I? Right? When you talk about the laws of tefillin, you don't talk about what kind of person I am, right? Because what you have to do, this is what the box has to look like, and you have to put it on this point in your arm at this time and wrap it in such and such a fashion, right? When it comes to Teshuva, there is that part. You have to say these words and you have to think these thoughts. But then because it's about how you feel, thoughts, it gets into what kind of person are you and what's motivating you, right? So there's that part of the philosophical element of what kind of person am I, like a moral code of conduct, not just a legal code of conduct. And number 2 is what are the philosophical underpinnings that allow for Teshuva, free choice, reward, punishment. Right?
Does it include these because they're necessary for the halachic?
So I don't know which one's first, the chicken or the egg, but it's clear that he codified these philosophies, which is what makes the laws of Teshuva so unique. Whereas most books on Teshuva are inspiration to do Teshuva, how to do Teshuva, tactics to do Teshuva, things you can tell yourself to motivate yourself to do Teshuva, and things of that nature. Like Rabbi Yonah, he has, like, what are the essential elements of Teshuva? What are the various different things that are going to support your Teshuva, and so on and so forth. But the Rambam gives it a legal element, like a legally defined, here is the philosophies you believe in, point A, B, C, and D. And as a result of that, therefore, X, Y, and Z. And thus, Teshuva must be done in such and such a fashion. Right? So the laws of Teshuva is really where you can see this uniqueness of the Rambam to codify Jewish philosophy. So it's a very, very unique set of halachas, and certainly a unique work on Teshuva. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you an overview as to all the 10 chapters of the Rambam's halachas of Teshuva, the laws of Teshuva, how they build one from the next. And then I'm going to show you from a bird's eye view where the Alter Rebbe's Igeret Teshuva fits in. And then as we go through the halachas, we're going to see all of that play out in the various halachas. So chapter 1 begins with, first of all, the technical definition, the technical mitzvah of Teshuva. Right? We talked about this in the introduction 2 weeks ago, that there's Teshuva, which is in the heart, the decision to no longer sin. And then there is the halachic requirement that it be verbalized. So the first thing he says, he gives the dictionary definition to the mitzvah, which is the verbalization of confession. But the bulk of chapter 1 is actually not even about Teshuva at all. It's about Kapara, about atonement. Now, atonement is not Teshuva. Atonement is the result of Teshuva. You can think of it something like this: prayer and God answering your prayers. You have a halachic obligation to pray. You have to say such and such words, and you have to think such and such thoughts. Now, if God answers my prayer and says yes when I ask him for health, or he says no, God forbid, either way, I fulfill my obligation to pray. Right? So God's response to my prayer doesn't define my legal obligation of prayer. It defines what I'm hoping to get out of prayer. And the same thing is true of atonement. My obligation is not to attain atonement. My obligation is to do teshuva, as we'll legally define it. But my hope is that God responds with atonement. And interestingly enough, the first chapter dedicates to not how to do teshuva, that comes in, or even what the legal definition of teshuva is, that comes in chapter 2. Chapter 1 is, what's the objective of teshuva? The objective is, I want to elicit from God a atonement. And he goes through the various different levels of atonement in chapter 1. And this is literally the same parallel that Rebbe points out in the Alter Rebbe's Igeret Teshuva. The Alter Rebbe's Igeret Teshuva, chapter 1, 2, and 3 are actually legal more than they are Hasidic or Kabbalistic. The Hasidic Kabbalistic begins in chapter 4 through the end, but chapter 1, 2, and 3 is, right, chapter 1, 2, and 3 is legal in nature, the halacha of Teshuva. And before the Alter Rebbe begins with the definition of Teshuva, he quotes a brayse, quotes a passage from the Gemara describing levels of kapara, levels of atonement, and explains them according to Chassidus in the parentheses. And then he gets into, now the mitzvah of Teshuva is, and gets into the definition of Teshuva. And Rebbe asks, why is he beginning it with kapara? Why is he beginning it with atonement? So Rebbe explains that the reason why the Alter Rebbe begins his work on Teshuva with the description of atonement is because even though it's true that atonement is not your job, atonement is God's response to your Teshuva, but from the start, you have to know what you're hoping for. Right? It's almost like before you start talking about how you're going to pray, first of all, talk about what you want in prayer. What you want in prayer is to elicit a response from God. Now, here's how you're going to do it.
Does Rambam do that in Tefillah?
I don't know.
Some sort of parallel?
I don't know if there's parallel exists in Tefillah. I don't know. But it's interesting that this pattern is both in the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam. That first begins with the description of atonement, which is God's response, and then gets into Teshuva. And it would seem like we're starting out with, what's the objective? What are you hoping for? You're hoping for God to cleanse your mistake. Now here's the process by which you'll get there. So that's chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 1 is a definition of atonement. And then chapter 2 gets into what is the essence of Teshuva? What is Teshuva? This decision in the heart to no longer sin, and so on. And then he gets into the various different methods of getting to Teshuva, darkei Teshuva as he calls them, which come as a result of that decision in my heart. And then, like, what's the frame of mind I should be in? When should I do Teshuva? Like Yom Kippur time, and the various different types of Teshuva relative to what type of sin. And you'll see this juxtaposition. In chapter 1, he talks about various different types of atonement related to different types of sin, whereas in chapter 2, various different teshuvas related to various different types of sin. Even though the teshuva is what's going to elicit the atonement that he mentioned in chapter 1. Right? Then comes chapter 3. The Rambam gets to the idea of reward and punishment. The idea of reward and punishment. Now, it seems that the reward and punishment is almost a description of God's view of how he's looking at your teshuva. Right? The first chapter where he talks about atonement and chapter 2 where he talks about teshuva, which elicits that atonement. It's all from the perspective of man. Like, here are the various different things that I've done, type of things that I could have done, and here are the various different type of atonements required, and here are the various different methods to get to that atonement. And then chapter 3 comes a discussion on reward and punishment, which is like God's view of what's happening. So what type of punishment goes for what type of thing, and at what point is a person cleared from punishment, and so on.
God's response.
Sorry? God, but yes. Well, we already talked about God's response in atonement in chapter 1. So chapter 3 is not atonement, it's a reward and punishment specifically. In other words, it's not so much about
the practical result of God's
response. Exactly. What's the result of God's atonement? Or what are the various different views that God might take of your reactions and behaviors? Right? And then chapter 4, the Rambam gets into what is, now that you know what teshuva is, the objective atonement, and you could see this whole idea of reward and punishment. So you see now the virtue of teshuva, you see the pathway of teshuva. Now comes chapter 4 and gets to almost prior to teshuva, meaning what are the type of life I should be living that's going to be most optimal for teshuva and for the atonement I seek. Right? Stay away from these kinds of things because that's going to hold you back from doing teshuva. These kinds of things are traps. Don't go there. Humility is something that's going to help you along your way to teshuva. In other words, once this comes in chapter 4, I think, rather than chapter 1, even though they precede teshuva. Like all the things in chapter 4 where it talks about like humility. Don't be egotistical. That's going to stop you from doing teshuva. Sins that are like that are people think of as no big deal. Those are the things that could prevent you from doing teshuva because you think, hey, it's no big deal. Right? See, all those kinds of things is what it describes in chapter 4. Mm-hmm. Now, he doesn't put those before he actually describes teshuva, it seems to me, because the essence of teshuva can be done without these things. And even if a person fell trapped to any of the things the Rambam says not to fall trapped to in chapter 4, you can still do teshuva. So he doesn't want you to think that teshuva is conditional to these types of ways of living. But these manners of living are the most optimal way to get to your teshuva. So having defined teshuva, having defined the objective of teshuva, having defined reward and punishment from God's perspective in response to teshuva, now he tells you, here's a lifestyle you should take on that's going to be most optimal for teshuva living, which is eventually what you want to get, this atonement and so on.
This would also be very, very abstract if you didn't know what teshuva was before learning.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Then chapter 5, the Rambam broadens the picture and gets to, in 5 and 6 and 7, Rambam gets to what's the the philosophical underpinnings that allow for teshuva, namely this idea of free choice and the centrality of free choice. Because if you talk about a mitzvah as a technical thing to fill in, okay, so there's I learn about what tefillin fulfillment looks like, and even if it's predetermined, there's still halach as to how teshuva has to be done, how let's say tefillin has to be done, or how Shabbos has to be done. But when it comes to teshuva, having just defined it as the free choice, the ways of life you choose and the path that you choose in life and how you think and how you act accordingly, you must come to the conclusion there's free choice. Because there's no free choice, then what are you choosing here? What are you getting atoned for? Why are you being rewarded and punished? Right? So that's chapter 5, where it gets into this idea of the centrality of free choice in Judaism in general, and specifically with teshuva. And then chapter 6, he goes even more broad and says, if there is free choice, so how do we deal with the fact that God makes decrees about the world at large? So over there, he deals with God's decree about what's going to happen in the world vis-a-vis the individual's free choice. And then in chapter 7, he gets into a whole new depth.
Just a question on that.
Yeah.
Is God's decree written in the world at large? Is that talking about it?
Like God decrees that
Pratis in general, or Pratis, how things that God decrees will
it's
affect my free choice?
More like things, how God's decrees affect your free choice. Like, for example, God makes a decree in a certain nation that such and such is going to happen.
Right.
So if God decides that a certain nation is going to suffer in such and such a way, what free choice do the people in there have? Mm-hmm. So he cites the idea of statistics and things of that nature. Mm-hmm. Okay, chapter 7, he gets to an even deeper level of Teshuva. In chapter 4, he described which behaviors you should stay away from and which behaviors you should seek out to live a lifestyle that's congruent with Teshuva. In chapter 7, he gets to a whole nother depth. Now that we've established you have free choice, and now that we established that this is the deepest part of your decision-making, now he gets into not just what you should and shouldn't do in order to live a life of Teshuva, but he gets much deeper than that. He gets into what kind of person do I want to be? What are the things that motivate me in life? What are the things I care about? What kind of Jew do I want to be? Much, much deeper. Like, for example, talks about the virtue of Teshuva, the virtue of connecting to God, right? The silliness of chasing after money, rather than exchanging the pursuit of money for the pursuit of God. So it's not just like, don't act this way, don't act that way, but much more, what kind of person do I want to be? And then in chapter 8, he gets into the world to come. In other words, so you want to be this kind of person who connects to God, where does it lead to? The world to come. And then he gets into how Torah is the pathway and how God helps the person to get to that ultimate objective of the world to come, and how that person's arrival at the world to come is actually part and parcel of the global mission to bring the world to the world to come, where he talks about Mashiach in chapter 9. And then chapter 10, it seems to me like he's talking about this idea. In chapter 10, he talks about the idea of truth and doing Teshuva because it's the truth and serving God because it's the truth. And it seems to me comes at the end, because having established that there is a ultimate objective to where man should go and where the world should go, that means we're assigning an objective truth to what is and what isn't. And if that's the case, then what you should be motivated by is you're part of the absolute truth. And that's how it concludes chapter 10. Now, it would seem to me that the Alter Rebbe's Teshuva begins after chapter 10. In other words, if you really want to do it right, you would learn the Rambam's 10 chapters of Teshuva, and then now you got to the point where you do the truth because it's the truth. After you've learned the beauty of it in chapter 7, and you learned the philosophy of it in chapter 4 and 5, and you learned the technicalities of it in earlier chapters, and now you've come to the point where, okay, this is the absolute truth, this is the service of God. Comes the Alter Rebbe in the Teshuva and defines what's the truth of Teshuva, what's the truth of sin, how sin is a disconnect from God, how sin is a dragging godliness into the lowest of places, and the truth of Teshuva is the reconciliation at the deepest levels. Right? Once we've established that we're seeking truth for the sake of truth, comes the Alter Rebbe in the Teshuva and tells you what's the truth of Teshuva. So in some ways, the Teshuva begins where Hilchos Teshuva ends, and it's not unsimilar to Sha'arei Echad V'Amunah. Book 2 of Tanya, which is about the unity of God, in many ways begins after you understand the Rambam's definition of God at the beginning of his book of Halacha. After you understand the Rambam's definition of God as an abstract, ethereal idea that's beyond description, that is the truth from which all other truths get their truths, the primary being from which all of the beings emerge, and so on and so forth. After you've really grasped that, then you can truly begin the Alter Rebbe's Sha'arei Echad V'Amunah, the Alter Rebbe's description of the one unity of God. And I think it's a similar thing here in Hilchos Teshuva. After you learn the beauty of Teshuva, what the lifestyle looks like, what the virtues are, God's response, the way in which to get there, and so on and so forth, and you see how it's part and parcel of the world view of getting the world to its ultimate destination of the world to come, and how this is the absolute truth. Now you come to the Alter Rebbe, who gives you a whole deeper understanding to what this truth that we're talking about is. So having said that, let's begin chapter 1 of Hilchos Teshuva. I posted a link if you're those watching here. I posted a link to that chapter in the WhatsApp group. And if you don't have the WhatsApp group, you can go to Chabad.org and search Rambam, and you can easily find it in a minute. You can find the chapter. Okay, so let's go through chapter 1. Hilchos Teshuva, the laws of Teshuva. There's the header before chapter 1, which says, right, every set of laws in the Rambam begins with which mitzvahs are going to be discussed in the following chapters. And in here he says, mitzvah sasei achas, we're only going to be discussing one positive commandment. Vihi, and this positive commandment has two components, as we discussed at length in our intro to this class last week. Number one, number one, that the sinner should return from his sin, meaning to abandon it, to turn away from it, to make a decision in his heart to no longer sin, and he does so before God. That's number one. Number two, he should confess. Those are the two components to the mitzvah. One in the heart, a decision to no longer sin, and number two, to confess along with that. That's the mitzvah. And as we explained last week, the primary here is the decision in the heart, and the confession is the actualized verbalization of that decision, similar to prayer, in which the primary element of prayer is the feeling of connection to God, and it's verbalized in the words of prayer. But when you define a mitzvah amongst the 613, you define it as the physicalized version of it, and thus the mitzvah is sometimes defined as confession, as we'll see in a moment. But that's because when you're defining a mitzvah, you define it by its physicalized, in this case, verbalized manifestation. But in essence, the mitzvah really is the decision in the heart. And as you can see it here, two things. The sinner should return from his sin, or should turn away from his sin before God. And number two, he should confess. Then he says, and we'll explain this mitzvah. And now he adds a line it doesn't mention in any other set of halachas, which is we're going to explain this mitzvah and all of the principles that come as a result of this mitzvah. That's what I was describing before, this idea of codified philosophy, the idea where he codifies free choice, where he codifies reward and punishment, where he codifies the world to come and so on and so forth, or the idea of pursuit of truth and all that. But these are all not the mitzvah teshuva. The mitzvah teshuva remains the technical abandon sin and confess, but there are all kinds of philosophies that come around with it. And that too will be explained in these chapters. These words, I don't think exist in any other set of halachas, I'm not sure. In most other set of halachas, it says, let's say laws of Shabbos. We're going to discuss, I don't know how many mitzvahs. Keep Shabbos, don't break Shabbos, don't walk out of the tchum, and don't light a fire. I think that's what it is. It's 4. Maybe there's another one. And then it says we're going to explain these mitzvahs in these prakim. It doesn't say, and we're going to explain the principles that come as a result. But here it does do that, right? He almost is telling you, I'm going to codify philosophy for you. There's the teshuva that we're going to codify, and also the principles that come as a result of it. Perek Rishon, chapter 1. Kol mitzvah shebetorah. There's only 4 halachas in this chapter, only 4 paragraphs, but they're very weighty with all of them. Kol mitzvah shebetorah, all mitzvahs in the Torah. They now say, whether we're talking about a positive commandment, thou shalt do something. Bein lo say, whether a negative commandment, thou shalt not. If someone transgressed one of these sins, bein bezadin, whether on purpose, bein bishkaga, whether accidentally, then what's the definition of the mitzvah? Kishe yaset teshuva. When he does teshuva, the yashiv mechetai, and turns away from his sin, chayav lisvades, he's obligated to confess lefnei hakel baruch hu, before the Lord may be blessed. So here you can see how, even though he said before that what's the mitzvah? Number 1, that the person should abandon sin. Number 2, he should confess. But now when he gives the legal definition of the mitzvah, he says, what's the mitzvah? The mitzvah is, now when you do teshuva, you should confess. In defining the mitzvah, he only gives the verbalized, the actualized manifestation of the mitzvah, even though the essence of the mitzvah is actually the decision you make in your heart. And he only says, Keshe yasa teshuva. When you do teshuva, you'll have to do confession, right? Which almost makes you think that the teshuva itself is not a mitzvah. But that's not the case, as we pointed out from the header, where he says the mitzvah is clearly to do teshuva. But as the Rabbi explained it to me, we learned last week, that when you count and you define a mitzvah, you define its manifest physicalized version. And in this case, the physicalized, verbalized version is the confession. But the mitzvah still remains in essence to return from sin. Okay? As the Rambam always does, he quotes a verse he cites to the verse that is the source for this mitzvah. Shenemar, as the verse reads, Ish or Isha, a man or a woman, ki yasim bikol chatos, ha'adam limel bal b'Hashem, will do any of the sins that man might transgress, the transgressions of God, Va'ashma nefesh, and his soul is at fault. He is at fault. Hahi of himself. His badu is chatosim. He should confess his sins. Asher also that he did. Zeh vidur dvarim. This refers to verbalized confession. Okay, so if the actualized mitzvah is confession, then what is confession? So vidur zeh mitzvah to say this confession is the mitzvah. As we explained before, the manifest actualized version of the mitzvah. So Kate said mizvada, how should he confess? Omer, he says, Ana Hashem, dear God, or please God. Chatasi, I sinned, avisi, there's three terminologies he uses here for sin. Chatasi, avisi, pashaiti. Chatasi is I sinned accidentally. Avisi, I sinned on purpose. Pashaiti, I rebelled. Those are the three things. And he starts from the lowest to the highest. Accidental, on purpose, and then rebel. As the Kesef Mishnah points out in the commentary, that there's a dispute about this in the Gemara, but this is the version that the Rambam tells us. So I did this all before you, and I've done such and such. So he has to verbalize the actual sin that he did, not just to say I sinned in general, but actually verbalize which sin. And I have regretted it. And I am embarrassed by my actions. And I will no longer do this again. When we get to chapter 2, I'm going to make a note in the fact that the Rambam says, I'm no longer going to do this sin ever again, whereas the Alter Rebbe says Teshuva is, I'm no longer going to sin, period. Big distinction between Alter Rebbe and Rambam, where Rambam says Teshuva is localized. I did this sin, I'm no longer going to do that again. Whereas Alter Rebbe says it's the abandonment of sin completely, totally. We'll talk more about that in chapter 2, when he defines Teshuva better.
Is there a practical difference? If there's a mitzvah when you sin to do tshuva, then you have to do it on every single sin, right?
And there are actually very big ramifications. Mm-hmm. If I did Teshuva on only one sin, when we're going to learn chapter 2 and see how the Alter Rebbe understands it, especially based on the way the Rebbe explains it, a person who, according to the Alter Rebbe, a person who did Teshuva for one sin has not done Teshuva at all. And you're going to see why and how deep that is. But anyway, for the Rambam here, it's clear that it's a specific sin. So a person, let's say, he has 10 sins he's struggling with, and he decides, I'm doing Teshuva for this particular one. I mean, he should for all, but if he decides he's going to do for one because he's mustered up the courage, I'm no longer going to do that sin again. Says the Rambam, turn to God and tell him, I did such and such. I'm embarrassed. I don't want to do it. I'm not doing this again. The other 9, we'll deal with it another time. But for now, I'm not doing this again. For the Alter Rebbe, it seems like that's not enough, but we'll talk about that tomorrow. Okay, so this is the essence of vidur, the essence of confession. But obviously, you can elaborate. And anyone who elaborates in his confession, and elaborates more in this idea of his regret, of his decision to no longer do it again, and so on and so forth, then it's more praiseworthy. But the essence of it is to say, I've sinned before you, God. I've done such and such. I regret it, and I'm not doing it again. Now, we just finished saying that anyone who sins should do teshuva and confess. But we already know from the Rambam's list of mitzvahs, right? The book of halachas is prefaced by its own list of mitzvahs, and there he says, and one of the mitzvahs are that anyone who sins should bring a korban. So I already know that this idea of bringing a korban, a sacrifice, exists, and I know now that teshuva also exists. So what are both of these things doing here? And which one's more important or the other? So he says, no. And the same thing is true of any sinner, whatever kind of sin it is. When they bring their offering, for their accidental sin, or for their sins which they did on purpose, they don't get atonement. Oh, now we're getting introduced to the ultimate objective of teshuva. You have lots of obligations to do. If a person sinned, he has to bring a korban. Sometimes you got to get lashes. Sometimes a person has to return the stolen object. But none of those acquire atonement. You want atonement? This is the mitzvah which does it. And therefore, no matter what other obligations you have, atonement will only come from this mitzvah. Moreover, a person can do this mitzvah and fulfill it in its entirety and not do the other ones. Meaning a person can do teshuva even though it's incomplete if he didn't return the stolen object, but the mitzvah of teshuva was done. So he won't be atoned because God's looking at him and saying, hold on a second, you're regretting stealing, but you're not giving back the stolen object. What kind of regret is that? But in theory, you did your teshuva, right? Certainly with respect to carbon, one can say that, as we're going to see in the next halacha, that nowadays we don't have any carbonas, and all we have is teshuva. Right? So what that is really telling us here is that you may have other obligations as a result of your sin, but the atonement element, which is the ultimate objective of teshuva, is specifically through this mitzvah called teshuva. As he says here. So even as someone who has to bring his carbonas, a miskap number carbonon, they do not get atonement with their carbon. Unless they do teshuva, the izvadu vidu dvarim, and they will confess verbally. Shenemar, as the verse says, with respect to those who bring a carbon, izvadu ashachatolav, and they shall confess the sin that they're bringing the carbon for. So a person who brings a carbon has to confess and do teshuva with that confession. Otherwise, as we're going to learn in chapter 2, the confession is a waste of time, right? So in order for atonement to be achieved, there has to be two things. First of all, he has to fulfill all his obligations as a result of that sin. In this case, bringing a carbon, bringing an offering. But that doesn't work unless it has the essential element, which is teshuva and the confession. And the same thing, even someone who's obligated to, who's been found guilty of capital punishment. So he's got to die at the hands of the court. But that's not his atonement. Well, maybe it is his atonement, but atonement is only a response from God to teshuva. So it's not going to help unless the person does teshuva. And the same thing with Chovei Malchus, and the same thing is true of those who require lashes. They will not get atoned just merely by the death or merely by their lashes, unless they do teshuva and make a decision never to do this again and confess. And the same thing is true. So this, all till now is all between man and God. Lashes is between man and God. Capital punishment sometimes is between man and man, but it's God through the court that's doing the capital punishment. And the same thing is true certainly with the carbon, with the offering in the temple, is certainly between man and God. Right? But moreover, the same thing is true of someone who hits a friend, who physically harms a friend, or he damages somebody else's property, even though he paid back what he's supposed to pay back. So the court obligated him to pay back, or the court didn't, to decide on his own to pay up whatever damages he inflicted. Nonetheless, he's still not atoned until he does teshuva and decides never to do it again and confesses. As it says, from all sins man does, whether it's between man and man or between man and God, a person has to do teshuva. And the essence of it seemingly is, I'm gleaning this from the way Chassidus explains this, especially what the Tzemach Tzedek writes in his commentary on the laws of teshuva, which is there's two parts to sin in every sin, right? But I'll use Tzemach Tzedek's language. There's two parts to sin. One part to sin is the desire I had to do that sin, and then there's the act of the sin. Right? The desire I had to do this, my desire, my enjoyment in that sin, my desire to want to do that sin, and there's the actual act of sin. Right? So the act of sin has to be fixed, and so does my desire for sin. What's the real problem with my desire for sin? Who's that a betrayal of? I want to steal money from somebody. If I don't steal, I didn't betray that person. Well, who did I betray? It's a betrayal of God. It's a heart betrayal of God. And therefore, the teshuva is a return to God. I turn to God and I say, I'm never going to do this again. Not that I turn to my fellow man and say, I'm never going to steal from you again. The teshuva is, how do you describe confession earlier? The person turns to God and says, Ana Hashem, dear God, I sinned. Whatever the sin is, even if it's a sin between man and man, I still have to turn to God and say, I don't want to sin anymore. Because I betrayed you by wanting to by my desire to transgress your command. That's the teshuva element. But then I also have to fix up the act I've done. And the act I've done is fixed up in all kinds of physicalized, active ways. Carbon, offering, lashes, returning the lost object if it's between man and man, paying the guy back if there's some sort of property damage or physical damage. I'm fixing up the act. Or if the bare minimum says it's a Tzemach Tzedek, even confession itself. Confession itself, which is a verbalized, manifest of my decision to no longer sin, the physical manifestation of my teshuva, that's the counteraction to the physical manifestation of my desire to sin, which was the actual sin.
The vidui is part of the teshuva for all of these.
Okay, so tomorrow again, when we compare the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam, we're going to see that for the Rambam, teshuva and vidui are one, but we're going to see the Alter Rebbe is going to split it a bit. The difference between teshuva and vidui. And we'll see a little bit now also in Halacha Gimel that teshuva really is a standalone thing. The decision in the heart is to be a standalone thing, and confession is like the manifest of it. It's the manifestation of it. It's the way you complete the teshuva. It's not the essence of teshuva. The essence of teshuva is the decision in the heart.
If we're including someone who is over something with shoygeg,
yeah,
how do we understand what the vidui is? That I will never come to do this again.
If you didn't do it on purpose. It's a klotz kasha, very good. It's a good klotz kasha. I'm guessing.
It's simple, like I never thought about it. It's a very simple question.
But I'm guessing the idea is I'm going to be more scrupulous about the circumstances that led me to forget about your mitzvah.
So that's what you would think that's what whatever restitution or whatever your chayev, that would accomplish that. But then you're also saying, like the statement sounds funny.
Right, but so I'm expanding on it. Not that I'm not going to do it again, but I'm going to be more careful about the circumstances that led me to forgetting your mitzvah. Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I would have to say. Look, it's a good point. I'll have to look into that. Good point. Okay, base. So now that we know that the ultimate objective of teshuva is atonement, and we know that teshuva is never mind that the teshuva, not just that the ultimate objective of teshuva is the atonement, but that teshuva is the primary key to attaining atonement, and thus no matter what else you're obligated in, teshuva stands at the core, whether you're obligated to return the stolen object, whether you're obligated to bring an offering, whether you're obligated to, God forbid, capital punishment. Teshuva is the main part that's going to elicit atonement. So out there, the Rambam gets into other things now, in which their Torah ascribes atonement, and he's going to identify that teshuva is required there too. Namely, sorry to mishaleach, the goat that's cast off the mountain on Yom Kippur. Right? Lafishi kapara, the high priest would take two goats. He did a raffle. One goat was offered in the temple. The other was thrown off a cliff. So, sorry, Mr. Leach, this goat that's thrown off the cliff, Lafishu kapara l'kol Yisrael, because it's atonement for all Jews. So you have to have two elements. You have to have confession, which is a manifest version, but that manifest version isn't useful unless it has teshuva. Now, the Kohen Gadol cannot do teshuva for me. He can't. If teshuva is a decision that I'm not going to sin, the high priest can make the decision on my behalf. So I have to make that decision. But the Kohen, the high priest, could do the confession. And therefore he says, Kohen Gadol is vadolov. When the Kohen Gadol does confession on, as he's doing the proceeding of throwing the goat, sending the goat to be thrown off. So he confesses Allah and Kol Yisrael. He says his confession on behalf of all the people. Shneimar, as the verse says, vadolov. As he should confess on this goat all the sins of all of Israel. So he can verbalize on behalf of everybody. And therefore, the goat that is sent away, atones for all sins of Torah, hakalos, the minor sins, vachamuris, and the more stricter sins. Whether they were transgressed purposefully, whether they've been transgressed inadvertently. Whether the person knows about it, whether he doesn't know about it. So this is the only element which is not included in the previous teshuva. Accidental sins I know about. Okay, you're asking what exactly is confession if you're never going to do it again if it's an accident. Okay, good question. But if I don't know about the sin, I certainly can't confess it. But that's something the high priest can do. The high priest can say, look, on behalf of all Jews, whether they know about it or don't know about it, I'm confessing and I'm asking God for your pardon. And if all of this is atoned by this goat. But this is predicated on the most primary condition. Sheyas at teshuva. If the person does teshuva and makes a decision to no longer sin again. Right? Because if vidui, if confession, as we just described it, is the physical manifestation of the Teshuva, then you can't have the physical manifestation without the actual Teshuva. So the high priest can do the confession on my behalf, but he can't do Teshuva on my behalf. He can't promise God that I'm not going to sin. I have to do that. So the goat that's sent off only works if I do Teshuva as well. With one exception. And this is something that the commentaries say is sort of unclear exactly, but this is what he says. You want to say something? But if the person himself doesn't do Teshuva, so then this goat does not atone for him because it's missing the main element, which is the Teshuva, which is the decision in the heart. But it does work, it works for minor sins. So apparently, there are certain sins that can be atoned during the times of the temple, even without Teshuva. However that works. Seems to be an anomaly. This is what he says, even though the commentaries ask about what this means exactly, but this is what he says. So, what are the minor sins and what are the major sins? Well, and what is the minor sins, and what are the more major sins? So, the major sins, the more grave sins, these are the sins which you would be liable for, Mrs. Bezdin, which a person would be liable for capital punishment, which includes violation of Shabbos, what else is on the list? Other things, but slipped my mind. Ikaris or excision, which includes violating Yom Kippur and eating chametz on Pesach. So those major sins, those are the ones that are not atoned for by the goat unless the person did Teshuva. But the shvuas shav, the sheker, a wasted vow or a vow in which a person lies. These are different types of vows, which we're not going to get into now. Even though these are not, a person's not liable for karas, a person's not liable for excision for these sins. Nonetheless, they are still part of the more stringent sins. Okay, so these are not covered unless a person does Teshuva along with the goat, along with the high priest sending the goat and confession. Now, Bishar Mitzvah say, and all other negative commandments, the don't do's, or mitzvah say and positive commandments, a person failed to put on tefillin, God forbid, one day or something like that. She'ain ben karas, which don't have resulting excision. Hey nakalas, these are the minor sins, which means, in the Rambam's view, a person doesn't do Teshuva. The very fact that Yom Kippur happened, it atones for the fact that the guy missed tefillin one day, even if he did so on purpose, even if he doesn't do Teshuva, which is a major, major chiddush, that a person fails to do a positive commandment and has no Teshuva, does not in any way make a decision, he's not going to miss it again. He may decide to miss it later, but because the goat was sent and the high priest confessed, he's atoned. Major chiddush, which the commentators discussed, but we're not going to go down that discussion now.
So that achieves the Teshuva element along with the Kapara that comes from all the punishments listed in Halacha Aleph?
Seems so. Seems so. But the reason why I'm not going down this route is because of the next halacha, which is now is man. So this is all in temple times. So once a year there was like this. There's like a joker, you know. There's a card that works even without Teshuva, at least for a whole bunch of sins, for the majority of them actually.
It's an omnibus pardon.
What's the word?
Omnibus. Everyone.
Omnibus, yeah, exactly. It's mass clemency.
I wanted to ask you, Rabbi Levi.
Yes.
The fact that he missed putting on tefillin that day.
Yeah.
That's an avera. That's an avera that he has to do tshuva on.
Sure. Called mitzvah opening halacha of this Hilchos Teshuva. Call on mitzvah shebetorah bein aseh ben loisaseh.
But he missed tefillin for that day. That day's gone.
That's right. This is what we say. These are the kinds of sins that cannot be rectified.
Oh, so they can't be rectified.
They can, but you still do Teshuva.
Yeah, because the day's gone.
I'm explaining this in a minute. I'm explaining that in a minute based on Alter Rebbe. I'll explain it when we get to the end of this chapter. I'm going to explain that. The difference between positive commandments and negative commandments vis-a-vis atonement. We'll get to that in a moment.
Okay.
Now, so all of this is in temple times where they had this free pass once a year. But at the time when the temple doesn't stand, nowadays, we don't have an altar of atonement. We have nothing other than Teshuva. And Hashuva mechaberes hakol averos. Teshuva atones for all sins. Note, he does not mention confession here. further to the point that the essence of it is the Teshuva. Confession is the physicalized version of it, but the essence here is Teshuva. Because we have nothing less than Teshuva, nothing other than Teshuva. And Teshuva works for all sins. Afilu Rasha Kol Yamav. Even if he's a sinner all of his days, he's a wicked man all of his days. V'asa Teshuva B'achrena, and does Teshuva in the last minute of his life. The last minute of his life, he makes a decision, I no longer want to sin. He knows he's going to die. But if he thinks to himself, if I survive, I'll never sin again, and dies 2 minutes later, he's no longer counted as wicked. The sinner, the wicked of his, will not stumble in his wickedness on the day he returns from his wickedness, on the day he moves away from his wickedness. On that day, he's no longer wicked. And here's the interesting thing, as we're going to learn in a moment, not always do you get atonement right away. Sometimes atonement takes time. But Teshuva happens instantaneously. Teshuva is, make this critical, Kapara is God's response. So God's response could be conditional. It could be conditional on Yom Kippur happening. It could be conditional. God says, if you want to get full atonement, you might have to go through some pain in life. I don't know, or a person has to donate X amount to charity. But the moment the person does Teshuva, even if he doesn't have atonement yet, he's no longer wicked anymore. And now he's a complete tzaddik. Because he fulfilled his obligation to do Teshuva. Just like prayer. I prayed in the morning. God says to my prayer, yes, you want money? No problem, but it's coming in next year. So I have to wait till next year to fulfill my obligation for prayer today. I prayed today, I did my obligation. So the moment the person does Teshuva, he decides he's not going to sin, he did his Teshuva and he's no longer wicked. Finished. Even though, as we're going to learn in the next halacha, there are different stages to atonement. And in that moment, in the moment of doing Teshuva, the essence of Kapara really is achieved, even though the full, complete Kapara is going to be more elaborate in the next halacha. Then he adds another line, the essence of the day of Yom Kippur atones, Lashavim for those who returned. Shenemar, as the verse reads, on this day will be atoned. I don't want to elaborate too much because we're running out of time, but I just want to point out the following. He says two things. First, he says, he quotes the verse which says, on the day the person does Teshuva, he's no longer wicked and his Teshuva is accepted. And then he says, 2 seconds later, that Yom Kippur atones only for the guy who does Teshuva. Well, if I did Teshuva, I already had clemency earlier, right? Moreover, in the next halacha is going to explain where Yom Kippur applies in terms of gaining atonement and when Yom Kippur is necessary for atonement, which type of sins require Yom Kippur. So why is he adding this line about Yom Kippur here? This points to the Hasidic idea, those that are familiar and understand that there's different levels of Teshuva. One level of Teshuva is the Teshuva that I do by making a decision I'm not going to sin. And what the decision I make is limited to my human experience and therefore is not truly infinite. But Yom Kippur is an infinite Teshuva, where the essence of the day Hashem says, you're mine, and therefore there's Teshuva. So before he gets into the details of atonement, he puts Yom Kippur here together with the statement. In other words, ever since the temple left, there's two things that are always available to you. A, Teshuva anytime, B, Yom Kippur. Those are two connections you have to Hashem that exist always. You can always decide, I'm no longer going to sin, and in that moment, you're no longer a Rasha, you're now a tzaddik. And number two, you have Yom Kippur, which gives you an essential connection to Hashem. Now he's going to get into the next halacha, the exact details of what kind of atonement you get for what, and what's necessary for which type of sin to get which type of atonement. But in terms of the essence of what Teshuva is available, you have two things, Teshuva and Yom Kippur. And it would seem that these are two levels of connection that he has to Hashem. One is, I decide to abandon sin on my terms. And number two is, the essence Hashem says, Yom Kippur gets cleansing. But that only works if a person does Teshuva. And now you can kind of see this flow in the Rambam. I'm not sure if that was clear. I think I was being a little bit quick there. But if it's not, please interrupt me. Okay, Dalit, final halacha. Even though Teshuva atones for everything. Okay, so not only does the moment a person did Teshuva, he's no longer a sinner, but the essence of atonement is already achieved. And moreover, the essence of Yom Kippur also brings an atonement. But nonetheless, there are certain sins that get their complete atonement in the moment a person does Teshuva. And there are other sins which don't get their complete atonement. He doesn't say the word complete, but I'm adding the word complete because he just finished saying before, Teshuva atones for all. And now he's saying, now there are certain sins that don't get atonement. So do you get atonement for all sins or not? That's why I'm saying that over here he's talking about a complete atonement, because basic atonement happens the moment the person does Teshuva. The question is about complete atonement, and we're even going to see the language of complete atonement coming up soon. Okay, so Teshuva gives basic atonement to everything. Yom Kippur, the essence of Yom Kippur also gives atonement. But then there are certain sins which get complete atonement right away, and certain sins which the completion of atonement comes later. Only after some time. How so? So what are the various different categories? See, the Teshuva remains the same for all of them. The Teshuva and confession remain the same. The Teshuva is, I'm not going to sin again, or I'm not going to do this sin again. And the confession is, I'm no longer going to do that sin again. Remains the same no matter what you do. Now, if you're talking about the ultimate objective of Teshuva, which is to get atonement, there are different classes. First of all, the moment you do Teshuva, you're no longer a sinner, you're now tzaddik. A. B, the essence of atonement happens right away also. Now, when it comes to complete and full atonement, there are levels. Some of them get their complete atonement right away, and others get their complete atonement after some time. Now, here are the various different classes for delayed atonement or delayed complete atonement. Class number one, over all the mitzvahs say, if a person transgressed a positive commandment, he failed to put on tefillin in the morning, he failed to say Shema, or whatever the positive commandment is, failed to shake lulav and esrog, whatever. She'ein bakaris, but it's a kind of commandment that does not have, that one would not be liable for excision. So it's not one of the more stringent sins, like Kippur or Pesach, Chametz on Pesach. Wait, that's actually a loisa say, but anyway. So now a person did such a sin. He failed to do a positive commandment, an ordinary positive commandment. V'asa teshuva, he does teshuva. Ein izaz misham, he doesn't move from that moment until he's completely atoned for right away. And to answer your question, David Seabag, so the person gets atonement right away in that moment. Now, the reason why he gets atonement right away in that moment, explains the Alter Rebbe, is not because it's a no big deal. Okay, so he missed the tefillin, that's why he gets atonement. It's actually the reverse. Because once a person failed to do a mitzvah, failed to put on tefillin one day, God forbid, so that day is gone. It can no longer be fixed. And what's the whole point of atonement? The whole point of atonement is to fix the mistake. If you want to put it this way, you can say like this. Teshuva is forward thinking. I'm no longer going to sin now going forward. Atonement is God's response to your past. Because you're making a decision from now on to no longer sin, God says, I'm going to cleanse your past. I'm cleansing your past. So now we have to look at the mistake made in the past and say, what kind of cleansing is necessary? The person failed to do a mitzvah. We can't go back to that day. So there's nothing more to do, which is why he doesn't even say until it's atoned right away. He says, you don't move from there till he's forgiven right away, because there's nothing more to do. You failed to do something last week. We can't go back to last week. So there's no atonement to be achieved here other than we forgive you. So no more cleansing to do, which is why when it comes to positive commandments, the teshuva is the end of the process. A person says to Hashem, I'm never going to miss this mitzvah again. Finished. That's the end of it. What more cleansing is there to do? There was no mess made. You just failed to do something positive, and we can't go back to it. So it's over. You're forgiven. Done. Now, be'elu nemar, of these kinds of mitzvahs, the pasuk says, "Shuvu banim shovim epa mishuvayseichem." Return, O wayward ones. I will heal your wounds, or what you're returning from. In other words, the healing comes right away. Now, so this is for positive commandments. A person failed to do a positive commandment. There's nothing other than I'm sorry, God, and God says, okay, you're forgiven, because you demonstrate you're no longer going to fail to do that mitzvah ever again. Hashem forgives because nothing else to do. But now, when overall loisa say, but if a person violated a negative commandment, so now there is a mess that has to be cleaned up. Every negative commandment causes a stain on the person's personal soul, and it causes a defect in the world. You spiritually destroyed some part of God's world. Now cleansing is required. So it's not like when it comes to the failed positive commandment in which we have to go to the past and try to fix it. We can't go to the past, so you're forgiven, and that's the end. Move forward. Okay, so you failed one day. What are we going to do? Done. Move on. But when it comes to a negative commandment, there's like a negative character trait that I've attained here. There's damage I've made in the world. I have to cleanse that. And that takes a process. And therefore, if a person violated a negative commandment, for which a person would not be liable for death either by the hands of heaven or by the hands of the court. So it's not one of the major violations of negative commandments. It's the ordinary violations of negative commandments, God forbid, failing to eating not kosher or things like that. So for teshuva, he does teshuva, he makes a decision, I'm never going to do that sin again, and he verbalizes. But now, and at that moment, he's no longer a wicked person. Right in that moment, he's no longer wicked, as we established in the previous halacha. And the essence of his atonement is already done. Why is the essence of his atonement done? Because in mitzvahs, again, there are two elements. One, we mentioned this before. One element is my relationship with God. By failing to do a mitzvah, I've ruined my relationship with God. It doesn't matter what kind of mitzvah it is. Whether I missed tefillin in the morning, I missed Shema, or whether I stole. In either case, I betrayed God. But then there's another issue, which is, how did you betray God? And what kind of mess did you make on your soul? What kind of, sorry, the lights went out here. Hold on a second. So number one is I betrayed God. But number two is the manner in which I betrayed God leaves a stain on myself and on the world. So when it comes to returning to God, I betrayed God, that happens instantaneously with Teshuva. I betrayed God and I turn to God and say, I'm no longer going to betray you again. God trusts, God believes me because he knows in my heart that I mean it. And our relationship is restored. So Teshuva is right then cleared. I'm no longer wicked. But the reality remains, there's still a stain on my soul from the past. And that requires cleansing. And therefore, if it's the kind of sin which actually left a stain on myself or a stain on my soul and a stain on the world, namely, I violated a negative commandment, I made a mess, so it has to be cleansed, then teshuva toila, teshuva hangs, that is to say, the teshuva was done, it's accomplished, and the essence of atonement has been achieved, but Yom Kippur machaper, Yom Kippur brings the ultimate atonement. And of these sins, the verse says, on this day, on Yom Kippur, you will be atoned. The Torah asks him to be purified for all of your sins before God you'll be purified. So this is class number two. Class number one is positive commandments. There's no mess. There's only a failure to do something. So we can't clean anything. So the moment the person does teshuva, forgiven, done. When it comes to a negative commandment, so I betrayed God, so I have to do teshuva. In that moment I did teshuva, God and I are squared away. But there's still a mess I made. And that's got to be cleaned up on Yom Kippur. But then there's a worse mess, a deeper mess, a mess which Yom Kippur itself can't cleanse. And that is, overarching, Mrs. Bezdin, a person violated a commandment for which a person would be liable for death by the hands of heaven or death by the court. Eating chametz on Yom Kippur, on Pesach, violating Yom Kippur, and other such sins. Then also teshuva, if a person did teshuva, so again, he's squared away with God. He's no longer wicked anymore. He's restored his relationship, but there's a serious mess he made because he did a sin which is of a high caliber. So teshuva and Yom Kippur are still hanging in the balance. They still don't fully clean up the mess. And this is very rough, but this is what he says. This comes from the Gemara. The pain he'll go through in life, the personal stress that will go through in life, they will bring the completion of atonement. Here he uses the word completion, because atonement really begins the moment he does teshuva already, as we mentioned before. But stress and anxiety and problems he goes through in life, they bring the complete confession that really cleans up the mess. You know, it's a rough and tumble thing when you go through a washing machine. And as a rule, a miskaper like kapara gemura, a person doesn't get complete and real full atonement until he goes through some sort of stress in life. This is very, very tough. And it seems like he's saying this as a rule in general for all mitzvahs. No matter what the teshuva is, real teshuva is going to come along with some sort of pressure. Now, there's two things. First of all, the author makes the point very clearly, very strongly, that self-inflicted pain is not the point. The point is that God does so if and when he decides. That's number one. Number two, we might say like this: why does it take pain in life to get real atonement? Why does pain cleanse the person? So it would seem, and this is a psychological phenomenon we observe, that when as a person matures, and he sees more of the world, and he has to face some of the stresses that life brings along. He becomes a more sensitive person. Become a more sensitive person. It's more sensitive to others. Right? So there's something about being put into a difficult spot that makes the person a little bit more sensitive. And that was the cause of sin. The cause of sin is lack of sensitivity. Not sensitive to the spiritual truth of the world, not sensitive to God's desires and needs and so on. And you just cavalierly did what you wanted. So like a person needs to be sensitive, be made sensitive. So in that sense, self-flagellation is not the point. But in that sense, a person could mentally put himself in a position that he understands the depth of his sin to the point that he feels broken over it. And that can give him the sensitivity. This is what the Alter Rebbe does in chapter 29 and 30 in book 1 of Tanya, and a little bit also in chapter 7 of Igeres Teshuva as well, where there he recommends that a person who feels, in chapter 29 and 30 of book 1 of Tanya, there he recommends that someone who feels lacking all, what's the word I'm looking for? He's cold, feels like he's hard shell, he's unmotivated, nothing moves, he's unmoved, unfazed. So how do we get him to start feeling sensitive? How do we get him to start feeling something? He wants to get emotions going. So he's got to crack the shell. You look at yourself in the mirror, I'm fine, leave me alone, everything's good. So the Alter Rebbe goes through a lengthy 2 chapters to say, no, you're not fine. You're in terrible position, and you're in terrible shape, and there is so much expected of you that you're completely failing. You're failing yourself, you're failing the world. Compared to others, you are horrible, a whole long thing. And the point is not to make you feel bad about yourself. The point is to crack that shell which says, I'm fine, leave me alone. And when that shell is cracked, then he starts to feel more sensitive. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on to say that he can truly serve God with joy. And this is a similar thing the Alter Rebbe says in the end of Igeres Teshuva, that after a person does Teshuva and he's broken over his sin, he's broken over the distance from God, and he feels sensitive to what he's done in his sin, then he can truly reconnect to Hashem in joy. Because the dam of his heart has been opened, been cracked. And once the dam has been broken, all emotions can come forward, including positive ones and happy ones and good ones, because he's made more sensitive. So perhaps then a person doesn't have to go through literal stress in life, but if he puts his mind into a place where he's not so cold, he's not so hard-shelled and crack that, then he can start to feel a little bit, and that would bring the atonement that is looking for here. And to cite the Medrash famously says that when the Pasuk says that the Jews worked brick and mortar in Mitzrayim, Chaymer Levenim, so Chaymer, Libun is Dalibun Hilchos, Chaymer is Dakal Chaymer, meaning to say the Medrash makes the comparison between the affliction of the Jewish people in Egypt and someone who toils to break his brain to learn, to understand Torah. It's a humbling experience. It's an experience that makes you feel a little more sensitive to spirituality, sensitive to others, sensitive to God. And that's really what we're looking for here, not just to make people suffer, God forbid. Okay, this is my own suggestion. Anyway, of this final class, so this is the 3rd class. The first class is positive sins. A person failed to do a positive sin, the first person failed to do a positive commandment, Teshuva, and forgiven right away. Number 2 is violated a negative commandment. There's a mess that's got to be cleaned up, and that takes Yom Kippur. And number 3 is these greater sins, which have a greater mess, and this requires some sort of stress in life to cause atonement. And of these, Nemar, the verse reads, I will remember, God says, I will remember their sins with a rod, meaning with strictness. With affliction, I'll remember their sin. Now it says the Rambam, 4th class. This 4th class, the Alter Rebbe did not mention in the Igeres Teshuva. In the Igeres Teshuva, the Alter Rebbe only mentions the first 3. The 4th one, the Alter Rebbe leaves out. And the Rebbe explains the reason why the Alter Rebbe leaves it out is because, as we're going to see, the 4th class, the atonement is achieved only at the moment of death. And the Alter Rebbe is only concerned with Teshuva for those who are alive. But the Rambam was more broad in that sense, includes this as well. Namely, the Medvar Mamurim, all of the above that a person can achieve atonement during his lifetime, after Teshuva, either through Yom Kippur or through Yom Kippur and stress or just Teshuva, whatever the class may be. This is all only B'Shaloi Chillas Hashem Be'esh Sha'avar. This is only someone who did not desecrate God's name at the moment of his transgression. I mean, he didn't publicly desecrate God's name, which is a sin that he did because he has an evil inclination. He did a sin like everybody else in the world. But But one who desecrates God's name purposefully and publicly and so on, even though he did Teshuva, Yom Kippur, and Yom Kippur arrived, and he's still sticking to his Teshuva, right? He made a decision he's not going to sin again. Comes Yom Kippur around, and he's still sticking to his guns, I'm never going to sin again. And he's gone through some stress in life. But because he publicly desecrated God's name, he doesn't get complete atonement. Atonement, yes, but not complete atonement, until the moment of his death. And therefore, rather, Teshuva, Yom Kippurim, the Yisurin, Shloshton Tolim, his Teshuva, his Yom Kippur, and the stress he goes through in life, all three of them, Tolim, they hang in the balance, Misa Mechaperes, and his death atones for him. Shenem, as the verse reads, it is known to the ears of God, Lord of hosts, if this person's sin has been atoned to the day of his death, as if to say there are certain sins that await till death. So this ends chapter 1. And as you can see, chapter 1, he defines right at the beginning, he tells us the objective. Where are we going? Teshuva, what is it in its terms of what we are hoping to achieve in Teshuva is atonement. There are other things a person has to do. He has to return the stolen object, he has to bring a carbon, whatever, he has to confess, and Yom Kippur has to happen, all these different things has to happen. But the essential key to atonement is Teshuva. And that itself is really in 2 stages. Number 1, the moment the person does Teshuva, he's no longer a wicked person, he's now a tzaddik. Not second. But then there is a cleansing that may have to be done. And if there's a cleansing, depending on what kind of sin, the cleansing takes more or less time. Chapter 2, God willing, tomorrow night, we get into what is Teshuva itself, not the objective of Teshuva, which is atonement as we described today, but rather what is Teshuva itself, what's the decision I have to make, and then what are the methods by which I can come to, what would be the results that would display the sincerity of my decision making. That all coming, God willing, tomorrow night. Wonderful night, Yidden. Thank you all for joining.
Go ahead. Thank you.
The video is supposed to be
Sorry?
the video.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be personalized to what one did, or it's what it says in the Siddur?
So Rambam writes that it should be, okay, we're going to learn tomorrow, but Rambam writes, so far we learned today that it has to be, I did such and such, which means you have to specify which sin. But we're going to see tomorrow, not exactly. We're going to discuss that more tomorrow. Whether you say specifically one sin or just in general all sins. We're going to see that more tomorrow, God willing. And we're going to compare that to the Alter Rebbe as well.
Shkoya.
Okay, good night.
Night.
So according to the Rebbe,
Yeah.
is the video, if the tshuva is more general, is the video also more general? It seems like
It's a good question.
Rambam, it's almost like for in our generation, I speak for myself, it's a possible proposition.
The Alter Rebbe's decision.
No, that actually the Rambam's. I need to remember every affair I did and list every single one and actually regret every single one. The Alter Rebbe's tshuva almost seems like a very Dorshvi sort of tshuva. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we're going to
dwell on each detail. I just want to see the interest there, you know?
It's going to become even more clear as we discuss the Rebbe tomorrow on that issue. That you're 100% right, and you're going to see tomorrow, Mamish is going to be crystallized. Okay,
You mentioned the
go on.
you mentioned Perik, I think it was Lamed, about the Bitush in there.
Yeah, Chavtes and Lamed, yeah.
I heard once a shir that I think he said that the Rebbe once said about the Sicha, where it's from. I can look it up, but that for our generation.
Tashem Memhei, the Rebbe said it in our generation, no meditas. Go straight to Simcha.
Right. Where's it from? Memhei?
Memhei, I believe. It's a famous mimer. It caused waves. They were like kilo canceling a whole part of however the beard is. Yeah, that's true.
Okay. Shkoyach.